Today, I am here to introduce Mayor Knox White. When we were considering who we would bring to open this conference officially, it was a pretty easy choice for us. Because if you have spent time in this beautiful city, you will know exactly why we invited the mayor and what efforts he's made to turn Greenville in what it is today. He has been on the city council since 1983 and the mayor of Greenville since 1995. And if you remember Greenville before his tenure as mayor, as I do, you'll appreciate what an extraordinary project of design he has undertaken over the last 26 years. A native of Greenville, Mayor White's tenure has been defined by neighborhood revitalization, economic development, and transformable projects for downtown. Over the past 2 decades, Greenville has earned national acclaim for its livability and pro-business environment and has become an award-winning destination. If you ask Mayor White what makes Greenville so unique, he'll tell you that it's due in large part to good planning and even greater partnerships. And I would add to that, that it's also due to a mayor that understands and appreciates the built environment and how to work with planning. Key projects and initiatives that have occurred under leadership include the removal of the Camper Down Bridge, the creation of Falls Parks and the Liberty Bridge, development along the Reedy River, and construction of a baseball stadium downtown, and my favorite, the Swamp Rabbit Trail. More recently, and just recently, opened Unity Park, which I encourage all of you to visit. The city also has invested in neighborhoods with initiatives such as sidewalk expansion and street resurfacing programs, investment in neighborhood parks, traffic calming, master plan, and commercial corridors, and an affordable housing strategy. For me as director of the School of Architecture and for all of the designers in the upstate of South Carolina, we're incredibly grateful for the work that Mayor Knox White has done. And it's with that gratitude that I give you Mayor White.
Sure, whatever. I don't think I have a slide there. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Oh my goodness, this is a large conference. I didn't know that when I was sitting up front, all you people back there. Good morning. Great to have you here. It's always great to have Clemson in Greenville. By the way, we've had this wonderful introduction of Clemson into our community the last several years. You may know the MBA school is on Main Street, and several other schools are now making their way over here. And we certainly hope to see more of a presence from this department of Clemson University in the years ahead. It means a lot to us. Glad to come by and give welcome and just also sort of share some excitement about some things going on. But for those who have not been to Greenville before, I noted you're here a number of days, so there's no excuse for not getting out and walking around. And I'll just kind of start with this overview. Our downtown is well planned, well designed, nothing by accident. We move things around if it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, we try something else. And it's all about walkability. And it's all about people and how they react to the built environment around them. There's a lot of psychology in that, as you know. And the walkability theme is really throughout. We focus on mixed use. Everything we do is mixed use. We focus on elements of personality. That's what we call it. Anything we have that makes us unique and different, we try to identify it and we try to make it bigger and enhance it and celebrate it. So walkability, mixed use, unique personality. That's kind of the mixture that's in the downtown ingredients. And you'll see that as you get out and walk around. People who come here sort of sense that the planning that's obviously in front of you, but also behind all of that, of course, is a good culture. A good culture here in Greenville of public-private partnerships, a good culture of collaboration, and people kind of working together. It's actually still like that around here, which is something to say these days. But that's the downtown. The other thing about downtown Greenville that as I reflect on it, as you walk around and kind of get a feel for it, as you walk through it, just go walk through it, you'll get the idea pretty quick. It's really about two things. It's about trees and it's about water. Simple as that. And so we build on that with the wonderful work now, not just the great trees along Main Street. It used to be a 4-lane street. Now it's a 2-lane with wide sidewalks, big trees that have grown out, walkability. But the water part was kind of new to us because just several years ago, Greenville didn't know it had a waterfall. Greenville didn't know it had a river. And now we do. Now the waterfall and the river is a centerpiece of downtown Greenville, Falls Park, which you definitely want to get down and see. We just recently opened like last week, Unity Park. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. That's in the downtown area. It's just upstream from the waterfall in downtown. It's 60 acres of new, never before seen green space in the middle of downtown Green. 60 acres. It's in an area that used to be part of a segregated park system, black park, white park in the 1930s and 40s. It's an area that was predominantly in more recent times warehouses, concrete, blighted buildings. You kind of get the picture of this kind of area. It's sort of like the, where do we put it section of town? Where do you put that? Just throw it over there. So the area literally had junk vehicles strewn around it just 10 years ago. It was the site of our Public Works Department, which has now been relocated to a beautiful new facility elsewhere. It's that kind of neighborhood. And it was on the edge of a predominantly African-American neighborhood that frankly, for decades, really resented the fact, and this is a quote from the neighborhood leadership, that for decades, the city put all its junk in our backyard. And that was true. That was absolutely accurate. Well, we've owned up to this history. We've dug into it and researched people in events in the 1930s and 40s. We've looked at what we have there, blew it all up with the help, with the work of the neighborhood and the help and partnership with the neighborhood. What was once concrete and blighted buildings, an undesirable place, is today 60 acres of beautiful green space called Unity Park in the middle of downtown Green. We just opened it last week. It's got children's spray parks. It's got playgrounds, all kind of bells and whistles in that, but it's also just got lots of walking trails and beautiful green space. Just opened last week. So please get by and see Unity Park. And now you know why the name is Unity Park, by the way, that it does inform the history, the very real history of the area. Let me end on one note relevant to your conference, because when I saw that what your conference was focused on, it really hits a chord with me, because this is something we've really been talking a lot about, and that's COVID, the impact of COVID, and how we got through it, how we dealt with it. And I don't mean the controversial issues of mask wearing and all the other things. We went through all that too here. I really just mean from a structural side. So here's the lesson we learned, and we really did learn some lessons. Many years ago, as we started our redevelopment of downtown Greenville, the number one focus, and I mean the alpha and omega, other than the walkability factor, the alpha and omega really was mixed use, in particular residential downtown. What could we do to have people live in downtown Greenville, which seemed in the 1990s and early 2000s, it still seemed like a preposterous idea. We made that our number one focus for several years. We sort of pushed the market, made some early redevelopment happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And we got 2 or 3 units here, 4 and 5 there, then later 50 units, and later 100 units, and later 300 and 400. And now we got, today, downtown Greenville has thousands of residential units in the downtown area. 5,000, I think, is the latest number. And people live downtown in droves, and all kind of development. It puts people on the street after 5 o'clock. It creates vibrancy on the weekends, all the good things that having residential in the downtown does, and it brings back retail, and boy, does it. So retail is back in downtown Greenville. So focus on mixed use. That's what we did it. Well, during COVID, we discovered something else. So Greenville went through COVID. You remember the lockdowns in March, and things really shut down, and a lot of cities had sort of tumbleweeds in the street. It was a horrible time. We did too for a little while. And then we'd come downtown, I'd come downtown, and I saw something really unusual. Unlike any other area of the whole city, in downtown, there were people on the streets. At the worst time. Why? They're walking their dog. They're out for a stroll. They live there. They live in the downtown area. And then a little later, when the shops and stores began to slowly open, they filled the coffee shops again. Outside dining, Greenville's always had outside dining. We've had wide sidewalks and outside dining for 25 years. In fact, if you have a restaurant in downtown Greenville, we ask you why you don't have outside dining. But during COVID, suddenly that became really important. Didn't think of that before. So a lot of cities I know had to deal with the issue of, do we take away some parking spaces? In Miami, they did this, in Chicago and other cities, to allow some outside dining. We didn't have to do any of that because we already had outside dining. We just picked up where we left off, on the street. So the point is, our strategy of bringing residential to the forefront in downtown to create street vibrancy and all that paid huge dividends during this time of COVID, because we had life and vitality in downtown, really, again, unlike any other place in the whole community in downtown, because of that, those decisions that were made. The other big decision that we made was to promote green space and personality, reclaim the Reedy River, create bike and walking trails all over the place, create beautiful green spaces, create a habit that people have in Greenville of coming downtown just to come downtown, because that's what people do on weekends here. They come in droves just to be downtown. And during COVID, things went dark, things got quiet. And then suddenly, as I said, people who lived here, suddenly they were back on the street again, walking around. The shops were closed, but they were out there walking around. And then a couple of weeks into it, about fourth week or so, we experienced the other wave. Thousands of people came downtown to walk along the Reedy River, to return to Falls Park, to walk on the bike and walking trail systems all over the city. In fact, we had so many people, we had to then have emergency meetings. What do we do about controlling the crowds downtown? So we think, looking back, we thought, well, isn't that interesting? So the whole push on residential downtown got us through COVID in a very remarkable way. And then the green space and the park space is what every city in America suddenly wanted to have desperately. And we had it in spades here with our park system. And now we're opening Unity Park with 60 more acres of green space and park space. So it just shows that even though that wasn't the plan, that's our huge big takeaway, that whatever we were doing, we feel like with great confidence, we were doing the right thing. We were doing it right. And we're going to continue to do more of it, is the whole point. And we made that point a few weeks ago, again, in the planning for Unity Park, that, hey, a lot of reasons to build green space, especially at a time of growth in a community. It's your best antidote. But hey, here's another reason you build green space. You never know when you may really need it. And we learned that lesson. So thank you for being here. And please do get out and walk around. It's an honor to have people with good, sharp eyes and insights into this kind of thing, to be in our city, walking around, noticing things, because that's what we're all about. We're trying to make the city the most livable and most beautiful city in America. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Mayor White once again for coming and introducing. He set this opening plenary perfect. The opening plenary, we have 3 speakers here. It's a great honor to have these 3. They represent 3 different perspectives. Can you hear me? We have Mike Lydon. We have Dr. Craig Zimring. And we have Robin Guenther. And the 3 of them represent 3 very different perspectives, but we're all working really towards the same goal that Mayor White just kind of introduced, which is why we really wanted to have this conference in Greenville. Dr. Craig Zimring is an environmental psychologist and a professor at Georgia Tech. He's probably trained half of the PhDs in here. He has been working for health and all design for a number of years. I'm not going to go too long into the bio so that we have plenty of time to hear from the speakers. Mike is an urban planner and designer, and he's really an advocate for livable communities and better design, exactly what Greenville is all about. And then Robin Guenther is an architect. She works for a large healthcare architecture firm, Perkins&Will, and I think she's been the champion for sustainability in healthcare design and really thinking about the intersection between human health, community health, and planetary health. So with a great honor, I'm going to introduce the speakers. I just introduced the speakers, and I'd like Robin to come up maybe and get started. And what the format for the session today is, they'll speak, each of them, and then we'll have a couple questions and then open it up for general questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. And for any of you who have ever heard me speak before, you know I show a lot of slides. So I am hoping that this is my friend and it can advance them as quickly as I want. So without further ado, I'll get started. And really, I want to set the stage, I think, for the 2 days of meeting. And really take a pretty broad and high level perspective on this topic of health for all. And I'm going to begin with the sort of state of the world, and then I'm going to move into the way we're all responding to that state of the world. So certainly there is a quickening around climate change. and a real sense of urgency that we need to adapt our built environments for a future that is different from the past and the current reality. And there has been a reckoning around equity and social justice. And really, I think the component of that we have to pay attention to is the realization that people's zip code is a more reliable indicator of their health status than their genetics. And that sort of underlies some of this movement. And certainly there's a crisis of biodiversity. You know, the estimate is now that we've lost about 20% of land creatures and as much as 40% of water creatures, or will in the next 20 years. So this is upon us, a new age of extinction. And certainly the question of whether we're entering an era of resistant infectious disease brought on by the first real global pandemic that we have all lived through is another huge factor in the state of the world. And I came upon this study earlier this year, and this notion about chemicals. And the fact is that we're releasing huge 220 billion tons of stuff into the air and water every year. Only 20% of that is the CO2 that people talk about being responsible for climate change. So what's the other 80%? And the question is starting to get asked about whether that 80% is in fact fueling. For some reason, this is a little sticky, this slide. Rising incidence of cancer globally, rising rates of asthma, and rising rates of neurodevelopmental disability. And what role might those chemicals play? And you know what those issues all have in common is that they stem from industrial systems. Mostly, I say 20th century, because the expansion of industry that has happened since the Second World War is staggering. The growth of population, the growth of development across the planet is truly staggering and is putting pressure on every one of those systems. And you know, my first intro to this was from Ray Anderson, who many of you know was the CEO of Interface Carpet down the road in Dalton, Georgia. And when he wrote this book, where he acknowledged that this can't go on and on and on, that industry as we know it has to change, that really got me started on this journey that I've been on for the last 25 years. But my colleague, Ken Geiser from UMass Lowell, says we have to see this as a design problem. This is about the way these systems were designed. It wouldn't all get solved if there was more environmental regulation. We just have to go back to the source of the problem, which is perfect for all of us here, designers, planners, academics. And certainly, Leland Kaiser, who reminds us that we're all designers of world health, raises this question to the design level as well. We are all designers of world health. So what is health? Leland Kaiser says it's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. And I would say that it's the definition of health as the absence of disease that has contributed to the mess that we're in, right? And that it's somehow all about healthcare instead of this larger societal issue. Oh, whoops, wrong one. I'll get this down. And the World Health Organization also has this much broader definition of health that echoes what Leland Kaiser said. And that underpins really, I think, this emerging approach to health that touches every one of those topics I started with, and actually the built environment in profound ways. So let's talk about how this definition of health can be a catalyst for the future of built environments. And there's sort of the scale axis in that, from the level of materials to buildings to communities to global and planetary health. And there's the time axis, from the time we extract the materials for the buildings to when we put them together, to when we inhabit them like we are today, and finally what happens to them when we tear them down. It's all part of that story. And obviously that's a lot to cover. But I want to start with framing it this way, that when health is the aim, according to Kentucky farmer and biologist Wendell Berry, good solutions act like healthy organs within the body. The solutions fix problems without creating new ones. Solutions create a cascading series of benefit instead of externalized harm. So how can we transform our built environments to that idea? And, you know, in the green building movement, we've been stuck in the lower left-hand quadrant of this diagram for about 15 to 20 years. We try to build buildings that are a little less bad. Okay, this building will use 20% less fossil fuel. This one will have these materials that aren't on anyone's red list. But is that good? It's simply the less harm model. And I sort of overlaid onto this diagram the less harm, no harm, heal model to say that we have to get to the upper right-hand quadrant of this diagram. We have to have built environments that restore some of the harm we've already done. And that's really the genesis of both what is termed in architecture restorative or regenerative design. And there are some examples of that beginning to emerge, but not many. So the question is, how do we get across this diagram? And I would argue that health is the catalyst that will pull us from one side, the current world, to the future of restorative design. Without prioritizing health, we will never get there. So that's the mission here for the future. And to do that, we have to connect our design decisions to their consequences. Whether that's land development and habitat destruction, whether it's energy choices and climate change, or whether it's chemicals and chemical body burden and illness. Whatever those consequences are, we have to look them in the eye and make better choices. Went the wrong way. Not me. So I'm going to start and talk a little bit about materials. So the US Green Building Council published this better building materials thing. And they said that we need to get to a world where our materials economy supports ecosystem, that's sort of messed up, I see, and human health, instead of destroys it. And I want to just say that in 1900, about 41% of what we built our buildings out of was natural or renewable. And today that's only 6%. So that means 94% of what is around us is synthetic or non-renewable. And that's a pretty steep climb. And that 94% of building materials is largely about refined from oil and petrochemicals. And you see the world of that world. that we now inhabit. And in order to take a flammable material like oil and put it in a building that doesn't burn down, you have to add a lot of other chemicals, none of which have really been tested for health and safety. And I will only say that if you look at that industry and you look at how they, all you have to do is Google it and look at how they talk about petrochemical building materials, it's always about performance and cost. It is never about health or fairness or end of life or persistence. That is not in the criteria that these designers are using to make new chemicals. We also, of course, are the first generation to spend 90% of our time indoors. By now, we're probably the second generation to do that, I must say, because time is marching on. And consequently, those materials matter to our health inside the buildings as well. And I love this quote from Dwell magazine, but this came out of actually a National Academy of Sciences convening on trying to develop a research agenda on the microbiome of the built environment. That we are living in a real-time microbial experiment. I almost said antimicrobial, right? But a real-time microbial experiment these days. And our office building might be hurting us. And when at Perkins&Will, we put together just sort of an example slides for different building types of where you can find all that potential harm in our buildings today. And of course, when the Chicago Tribune, who won a Pulitzer Prize, found out that all the flame retardants that we were putting in upholstery and furniture actually didn't produce the results that the manufacturers claimed, they joined hands with environmental advocates and ultimately got codes changed to not require those substances. And that's the kind of movement that we need to see across there. NYU Langone just put out a study in environmental pollution that said, you know, plastics, now people are able to say how these pollutants are impacting average lifespan, right? So, and premature deaths. So you see this data coming out now rapidly in an era when people can gather this data and report on it. And certainly the CDC has been looking at our chemical body burden in Americans since the year 2000. And it continues to go up in persistent chemicals. And when you look at Hoosick Falls, which had New York's best tasting water in 1987, and now it's a cancer cluster, you say to yourself, what's wrong with this picture? Would we really have wanted stain repellent treatments on fabric if we thought it was giving people and their pets cancer? I don't think anyone would choose that. And what we see from the studies, this is actually a screenshot of a study that the Chan School of Public Health just published, where Harvard actually has been trying to clean up chemicals in the indoor environments in their academic buildings. And so they finally went in and measured whether it was having any real impact or not. And sure enough, if you take it out, you don't have the problem anymore. And then the cognitive studies that have been done on green buildings, which in addition to healthier materials, are generally better indoor air quality, more daylight, better acoustic environments. There's a whole set of quote benefits that go with those. And certainly what we're seeing is that human performance is better in those buildings. And theoretically health. So now I want to talk just a minute about climate change and recognize that To me, a sea change in healthcare was when the Lancet in 2015 published this study, where they said, this represents an unacceptably high and potentially catastrophic risk to human health. And they went on to say that it had the potential to undo 50 years of public health gains across the globe. And what they were talking about was not simply the impact of sea level rise. What they were talking about was really the pollution, the air pollution generated by burning fossil fuel, in addition to CO2, as having measurable health impact. And they went on to publish other studies between 2015 and 2021 that continues to build on that evidence. And certainly, if we look at extreme weather, which directly impacts health of people through shock events, it continues to rise. This is the federal government data on it, billion-dollar weather disasters in the US by year. And of course, many of you probably know this one. This is the classic CDC one, looking at the impact of climate change on disease vectors and really also human health. And when we see that owners take action across the country, more really than the government, you're seeing large owners, IKEA, GM, Kaiser Permanente, Cleveland Clinic, really becoming serious about taking on eliminating fossil fuel and setting real targets for the phase out of that. And they're doing it based on health. And I just want to say a couple things about end of life for buildings. I couldn't resist this. Many of you might have seen this on the Weather Channel a few weeks ago, which is cast off synthetic clothing in the Atacama Desert. Hundreds of thousands of tons of clothing that is leaching into groundwater because there's nowhere else to put it. And we all know about the garbage patches. But it's not really better in the C&D waste world from demolishing buildings. C&D waste is twice the volume of municipal household waste in the United States, and only 20% of it is recycled. Because we don't design buildings for disassembly. So it's almost impossible to recover those materials. And so I ask us all to think about the legacy for our children and grandchildren, because for them, as resource scarcity increases, they're going to need our buildings for their feedstocks. And we have to be careful about what we're putting in them to make them harvestable. And so now I'm just going to end by saying, what are we going to do about this? And I have to say, in all the work that I've done and all the reading I've done, I keep coming back to Daniel Goleman, ecological intelligence, and his idea about swarm rules. That we have to develop sort of a group consciousness about this. We have to behave like a swarm. And he talks about that and says, says you have to know your impacts, you have to favor improvement, and you have to share what you learn. And I'm just going to show one example of each one of that comes from the material health movement, because there is so much activity there now that really aligns with this idea that I really hope you think about how you can apply this to your work. So how do we know our impacts? It's all about the research that you're doing every day as environmental design researchers, environmental psychologists, the reports that architects and designers are doing, the nonprofits working in this world. It's all about getting the information into the hands of owners and designers to make better decisions. then we do have to make better decisions. And now we're being able to rank decisions. There are good building products, better building products, best building products. That didn't exist 5 years ago. It barely existed 3 years ago. So it's really starting to move. And then we have to share what we learn. That's what you're all doing here. That's what you'll do through podcasts, through webinars, through reports, through the output of your work. And I really want to end now on these two ideas. One is there are no solo acts in this kind of transformation. People have already on the stage talked about partnerships, talked about working together, talked about the success of Greenville because of working together. This kind of change doesn't happen because of any one report or any single piece of research. It happens when someone over there does a piece of research, then somebody over here builds on it, and you're sharing it and you are partnering with people to improve the impact, to deepen the impact. And that's what we need to do. We have to become that swarm and recognize that we're in this together, and we will transform our built environment only if we work together. And the last thing I want to say is that Martin Luther King once told us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I say to all of us that our job is to make sure it bends toward health. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Real people in a real room. Second time for me. This has been a reality in more than 2 years, so it's great to see you all. And I've not really interfaced with this group, I think, much in the past, so thanks for having me. I'm here to talk about streets and public spaces, so all the things between our buildings that make our cities healthier and how we can get there and get there faster. So how many of you are aware of this idea or worked on projects perhaps, or even researched tactical urbanism? Can I see a show of hands? All right, good fair number, great. Very quickly, I'm a co-founder and principal at Street Plans. We're a planning and urban design firm based in Miami and New York City. We're a small team of 14 people, but we work on different types of projects all across the country and even abroad. We focus on planning and urban design, on actually getting to technical design for implementation, and then programming and enlivening our streets and public spaces. This is going to be a challenge. So part of our motivation, and we are passionate about streets, we're passionate about how people get around safely in their communities, is that we've put people in the US in a position where they're driving more for everything, right? So we've doubled our population since 1950, and we have 7 times the vehicle miles traveled, which means we're all running around our communities, around our regions, driving, and that has really, really negative consequences socially, obviously ecologically, in terms of health and safety. Just this past year in 2020, we saw there was a 10.5% increase in fatal crashes in the United States. That's already, we're at one of the highest levels for an industrialized country in the globe. Our streets are some of the least safe in the world. And part of that is because we are exposing ourselves, having to drive, and we design for that driving, and it makes everyone outside of the car less safe, particularly pedestrians. As a part of all this, we've now seen that transport is the sector that produces the most emissions. So buildings and power generation, other sectors have now fallen below transportation emissions. So we have a really, really big lever to pull on here in thinking about how we design in our communities for getting people to go from point A to point B. And of course, the best trip is the one that's not taken in terms of using a vehicle, at least a fossil fuel vehicle. And the local actions over the last several generations, this street gets widened here, this highway gets built there, this strip mall gets put way out there. Those local decisions through zoning codes and transportation policy and funding mechanisms from the federal government on down to local dollars spent have global outcomes. This is the point we just heard all about, which is obviously very problematic. And if I could just summarize, we are in this moment of a convergence of crises. And this headline from that last keynote that I did in Montana last September, this was what I read just before I touched down. The air had finally just cleared in Montana. Now imagine living in this great state of being able to be outdoors all the time, doing amazing things recreationally and not being able to do it. And then you layer in COVID and putting people into buildings, relief centers, libraries where they can access resources and stay protected from the air they can't breathe. And now you're passing around this global pandemic. It's really, truly stunning. So we can't keep building and designing our cities, in particular our streets, like this. It's obviously not working for us. So one of the things that we do at Street Plans is to really think about decarbonizing and at the same time humanizing our cities. So this is a project example from Soho in New York City. So you probably walked, this is Broadway, you probably walked right down the street if you visited New York City. This is what it looks like today. And through a public realm plan, which I'll speak more about later, the idea is to take it to a much more low traffic, human-oriented environment. But the challenge is streets are political spaces. They're contested. People have very strong opinions about what happens between our buildings, it turns out. And so the common reaction to when you propose something like this is, no, we don't want this change. We're not going to, we understand these big global problems. When it comes to our block, when it comes to our neighborhood, people like to say no to pretty much everything. So we have this political reality that's built on conventional project delivery, which over generations in the United States has been focused on large projects that are inflexible, that are very expensive and have very extended timelines, right? From the federal government on down to the local level. And those projects, as they get built over time, have done things to divide us, not bring us together. And through those processes in project delivery, we've actually created, a large environment of distrust. And that plays out time and time again in our work as we propose a small change on a street for 5 blocks in the middle of New York City, where you would think it would be a good place to walk. So we have a real challenge to get over this system. Now, there has been a reaction to this, and some might say an overreaction in terms of the outcomes we're all seeking are now encumbered by an incredible number of processes that make it very, very challenging to get anything done at all, even when you have alignment. And this was a great quote from a professor at University of Michigan, who is focused on, the process needs to have better outcomes, not just process, we need to be focused on the outcomes themselves. And this was quoted in Ezra Klein opinion piece in the New York Times last weekend that really resonated with me, is so much about getting to a better and brighter, inclusive, healthier future is actually getting there. And if our processes don't support us getting there quickly, we're in big trouble. So 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we started Street Plans because we wanted to get to outcomes faster. How can we get people to experience these changes and have a wider audience of people actually understand what we're talking about when we say walkability, safe streets, healthier public spaces, and not just have it be confined to the people with a lot of time and money who come to rooms and just want to say no and put up barricades. So back in 2009, we had the first open streets when I was living and working in Miami, and it was a transformative moment in the community to understand that streets aren't just for driving and parking our vehicles. And that was really an aha moment where we said we should need to build on this. Now, there's a lot I could talk about between now and then, but fast forward to right now, that same street I just showed you is under construction to be a shared street, one that's oriented and designed for pedestrians first. And so that, in a nutshell, is how we use the temporary and the quick and the inexpensive. That, in a nutshell, is what we call tactical urbanism, which is the community building methods that are short-term, low cost, but scalable, and from the very beginning intended to create long-term change. So the benefits are that people, when we actually go out and do things together in our streets, work together in new ways. People get to experience that change and actually understand it viscerally. Our methods are data-driven, so we can actually see what works and, more importantly, what doesn't in these temporary or interim projects and build on those. So we're investing our limited resources in the things that do work, and we're able to build political will faster. So it's this, iterative process where you can start with something very small and build from there. That's actually a quite intentional process that we've built on over the years, which goes from this focus on long-term big projects and kind of goes in reverse and starts with something small for a day, for a month, for a year. And then what do you do when you have a successful project, let's say as a pilot project? What do you do with all of these pilots we all do? There's this gap, right? There's always this gap between the pilot and being able to get to that long-term outcome. That's what we call interim design. And all of these, I know it's hard to read, but all of these sort of buckets of project delivery have different engagement methods, evaluation methods, design and materials that we would use that meet the needs of those certain intervals of project delivery. And they can very quickly add up and form lasting investment and bring those changes faster. So quickly, I'll go through 10 applications, share a couple of examples, and then talk about how this has impacted COVID. So a lot of tactical urbanism has its roots in advocacy and activism, sometimes with permission, sometimes without. That's certainly one kind of project, but it can get things moving. Tactical urbanism can be used for engagement during a planning process. Don't just invite people indoors, have them come out and actually make a change and experience it and be a part of that as a tool for engagement while you're thinking of ways to improve a community through a planning process. Number 3, community engagement after a planning process. And that's when you've completed the plan. Now what? You have to continue momentum. What do you do? Start small, start quick, and try to identify the things where there is community support and buy-in for lasting change. 4, pilot projects can be great as a way to inform and create better capital construction projects. So those big ticket items, why not pilot them and design to learn so that the long-term design is more effective. There's a lot of materials that are out there that a lot of communities are trying. It's a great platform for trying those things and seeing what works based on your climates, your maintenance practices, your capacities, your volunteer ecosystems, all those things. Research experiences, I think this is something, or experiments, this is something that's very germane to this audience, is that you can design, tactical urbanism projects to answer research questions. And I'll share an example of that. And then 7, this final point I'll make in a minute is on this crisis response. And we've seen tactical urbanism, scaled dramatically across the globe during the pandemic. It's also been used to respond to floods, earthquakes, hurricanes. It's a way to get things going quickly when there's a need to do so. Finally, seasonal streets, we're in seasonal spaces, we can accommodate demand. If you're in certain parts of the country, you've got an influx of people in the summer, hardly any demand in the winter, you can change our streets and spaces that way. And then number 9, pre-vitalizing a development site. So bringing life, energy, activity, economic activity to a site that might be developed for the long term, but using that as a way to get the programming and people to engage with the site early and often. And then 10, there's a way to develop policies, programs, guides to support this work, right? There's a lot of this that's not been done before in many, many US communities. And so we've been pushing that a lot as you got to create a framework for it to truly be scalable and effective. So speaking of Soho, speaking of the challenge of getting things done, the challenge of getting to yes, streets are political spaces, remember, we had that initial response from sort of the higher level engaged folks in the community and decided that we had to go out on the street and see what the people actually thought, right, about this work. And I won't go through all the details, but over 1 month, every weekend, we had this demonstration project on 1 block of Prince Street. And the idea was to actually do a lot of measuring and evaluation, quantitative and qualitative, about what was working and what wasn't on the street, to communicate that back to the community and to the city and all the partners that were engaged in this. A couple of things I'll pull out of this data. We had almost 8,000 people walking through in just a 3-hour period over on a street that typically has only 4,500 cars a day. So who are we designing for? People or for cars? The demand is tremendous for people in this location. We learned that the noise with the plaza came down below what is considered to be super loud and with cars, quiet, peaceful, more livable, less stress. And then finally, we learned that people really want to be in a place where they could just incredible architecture incredible people watching. We found that a quarter of the people were from the neighborhood, half were from Manhattan, 70% of visitors were from the city itself. People were there largely to shop. They got there by walking and taking transit. And overall, almost 90% of people agreed that there should be more spaces like that and would like to see that plaza be made more permanent. 90%. Very different outcome from when we heard from those who are supposed to represent the community at large through the planning process. And when we peeled that back and looked at just the residents of Soho who answered the survey, it was almost 80%. So we uncovered that there's actual support and demand for that kind of change, which can be used as a way to politically justify making investments and moving forward with the fact that the people who are against it are actually a very small, vocal, and well-connected and powerful minority of voices. That's one example. Pilots as capital planning process. This is closer to home here in Greenville, over in Asheville, North Carolina. We worked on a pilot project there, which was tied to a coming capital project along a street called Cox Avenue. It's about a 6-block long stretch that's just adjacent to the core downtown in Asheville, and it was in line for an upgrade. And so this was a partnership with Asheville on Bikes, the city, ARP, and many other partners, including 125 volunteers who helped us transform this street over the course of a weekend. And we wanted to really understand the outcomes from a safety and speed perspective, which were known issues along this corridor. And so using these temporary materials, we found that we could reduce speed by 28%. 2 out of 3 cars were speeding before in the before condition. That became 1 out of 5. So a real big reduction in speeding, which of course means less severity when injuries and crashes do occur. The highest before speed, I kid you not, was almost 90 miles per hour on this 2-lane street in downtown Asheville. The highest speed recorded after was 41 miles per hour, and the same number of cars were traveling. So I can go into a lot more details about this, but basically we saw the outcomes that we wanted to see with the geometric changes we made on the street and the way that that could inform the long-term project. We also partnered with an organization called State of Place, which uses more than 200 different variables, urban design variables, to sort of calculate impacts of projects. We found that the quality index score went from a 42.3 along the corridor up to almost a 72, and that the economic impact of this was geared to, or was predicted to result in a return on investment of almost $24 per dollar spent to implement the project itself. So a big economic impact as well for local businesses. And finally, the next steps on this project is they've put out a tender for actually rebuilding the street in a permanent way. And so the tactical year-plus long project was used in that way to inform what will happen next. So research experiment. Has anyone followed Charles Montgomery's work for the last 10 years or so? Tremendous, one person I see, tremendous author and advocate for livable cities. He wrote a book called Happy City. We were able to partner with him with a grant from the Van Allen Institute back in 2017 to answer this question of how do we get people in downtown West Palm Beach to actually use and access the waterfront. So this was a partnership with Happy City, with Jennifer Rowe, who some of you may know at University of Virginia, and then a group out of England called Space Syntax. And our role in the project was to actually create this demonstration project, which a control group would walk the space, walk the waterfront, and they would measure lots of different, physical responses and sort of qualitative responses to the space, make the quick change, and then take the same group and walk them back through the space and see what the differences would be. So it's just one big, 2-day experiment. So there you can see what the tactical intervention looked like. We just added seating, some shade, and what we call these fascination frames, which showed what the waterfront looked like, historically from certain vantage points that would just make people stop and think and kind of get connected to the history and to the space itself. And then measured again what the before and after was for all our participants. So the control versus the intervention results at a very high level is that there's a strong and positive effect on perceptions of social trust, of place belonging and place quality. One of the questions asked was, if you were to lose your wallet, how much would you believe that when you came back to the space, it would still be there? So it's kind of taking that sort of line of inquiry. There is a strong and positive effect on people's perception of their own level of stress. So they felt calmer when they're in the space in the after condition. And then a large increase in restoration and well-being, feeling like you belong in this space. It was comfortable. And then even though we did pedestrian and bicycle counts on the waterfront, they were exactly the same, more or less, than before and after, but there was a 500% increase in stationary activity, meaning that people sat down and enjoyed that space. So this is like maybe $1,500 worth of materials that very quick, very cheap, that allowed us to really understand the very simple changes that could be made along the waterfront to make it more attractive and useful to people. So these are projects that all happen, primarily before, or this is like tactical urbanism before the pandemic in a lot of ways. And then the pandemic hits, right? This is my neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. And it was, early days in March and April, a pretty grim place to be. Our playgrounds were shut down. The businesses were shut down. We're all, more or less cooped up inside. And, we started to see this imperative that very quickly designers had to start thinking about this new increment of 6 feet, right? And of course, where I'm from in New England, we took kind of a sardonic approach on that, by staying wicked fat pot. And then the goofy Canadians put on their social distancing machines and walked around Toronto and realized, geez, this is actually pretty tough to stay 6 feet apart from each other. Maybe we should do something about this, right? So we start at Street Plans, we start a very quick and very sort of skeletal research project using a Google Sheet. We started tracking what cities around the world were doing in response. And what this really came down to, remarkably, was 6 different types of changes primarily, and it all had to do with the street, right? How are we going to make space for people in spaces that already exist, but are primarily dominated by cars? And that's really at the essence of it. And so from opening up the curbs for pickup and drop off, for curbside delivery, to outdoor dining, not everywhere is Greenville, South Carolina, unfortunately, in terms of outdoor dining. And even turning off the pedestrian beg buttons. Like, why didn't we do that years ago? But in any event, remember, this is when people thought that we would transmit COVID by touching the same button. So remember, this is very early days. But remarkably, this had a lot of response. People were looking for information, looking for ways to do things quickly. And it turns out this sort of tactical approach was there and ready to respond to this crisis. And so we partnered with NACTO, the North American City Transportation Officials Organization, and their affiliate, the Global Designing Cities Initiative, and put this together into a package of guidance and direction for communities on how they can respond to not just walking and cycling and being outdoors, obviously, but to delivering services in the streets, like testing, right? Or how are we going to respond to, at the same time, this overlay of the social justice crisis that really bubbled up at the beginning and through the first year of COVID, and seeing all those outcomes, that our streets aren't just for moving, but they're for us as people to protest, right? And use as civic spaces. And so there's all sorts of different guidance that we put out there in the span of about 6 weeks. So a very quick project that resulted in about 15 different cut sheets that are 2 pages each of guidance on how to respond to not just the pandemics and its immediate demands, but how do we use streets to recover, to create better places longer term, right? It turns out we actually like being able to eat and socialize outdoor. We like having less noise and less driving. We like to be able to walk and have our communities be more safe. So if you want to dig into this, we couldn't keep track of this, day to day. After about 3 months, we had to kind of partner with other entities to kind of take it up and maintain it. And so the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, the University of North Carolina, the University of the Andes in Bogota, and then an organization called NUMO, which focuses on new mobility, became partners and put together this database with us that has more than 400 cities in it from 45 countries and almost 1,400 different applications on how communities responded to COVID. And of course, within that, there are a lot of lessons. I'm going to pull out maybe just 5 quick ones while I end this talk. One is, we can manage our streets flexibly. Again, we've had this sort of static notion for far too long about what streets are for. And at the end of the day, they need to be used in multiple different ways for multiple different purposes. These are just a few images from New York City, and the one in the lower right there is from a small community called Hudson, New York, on how we responded in terms of managing those streets, right? So the The one on the upper left there is a neighborhood where we have our office called Dumbo, and took over the street and allowed for distancing, but also for gathering among small groups and eating and enjoying the space. That is going to be made permanent, right? So that's already coming online, to managing access based on time of day of the week, season of the year, as you see in the upper right and the lower left, being really creative and tactical in how we can do this. This is a lesson we should take with us far into the future, well beyond COVID. We create much better spaces for people when we do this. Two, social context is very often more important than the physical context. So in Oakland, California, they had a program called Slow Streets. They designed, or they intended to have about 74 miles of neighborhood residential streets that would be transformed into these slow streets so people could use them for safe gathering and recreation and being outdoors. And they based that on a bike plan which called for these neighborhood greenways in those settings. And in a lot of the white and wealthier neighborhoods, it was very well received. In the Black and brown communities in Oakland, it was not well received at all. And the city at first couldn't quite figure out, well, doesn't everyone want to be outdoors? This is something we're trying to bring to every neighborhood in the city. And it turns out that the material language of the slow streets was cones, construction barricades, ugly traffic signs. And to the communities that had been recently impacted by the construction of a BRT line, for example, through their neighborhood for years, what they saw was not a welcoming invitation to use the street. It was a construction project that they had no knowledge about, no communication about, and they had a very visceral and negative reaction to that. A lot of folks just wanted to get across the street safely, get to the bus stop, get to the grocery store, to the pharmacy. So the city pivoted the program, not only in what they started calling essential places, so making street design changes to allow better access and safe access to core services, but to change the materials themselves. So they partnered with local artists. This is a good example here. You see the mayor on the right there, and these neighborhood residents planting this new planter, which was painted over and designed with a local artist, which had trust and buy-in from the community. So I think it's really important to think about these lessons, that one thing doesn't apply everywhere across a whole city, particularly a complex one like Oakland. Streets produce tremendous value. And I'm saying economic value, not just social and health value, but economic value. And we need to share that value creation equally across our communities. This is, again, an example, because I spent most of the last 2 years actually in New York, from New York City, of how we took over what's called Vanderbilt Avenue, and a neighborhood adjacent to my own. On the weekends, it looks like this. And the amount of revenue generation thrown off to the tax rolls and to local businesses, is tremendous when you take into account that now we can eat both indoors and outdoors. So this street is being made permanent as well. The whole program, we had at the peak about 12,000 restaurants outdoors in some fashion, either on sidewalks, in the parking lane, or on the whole street itself, like I just showed you. It's credited with saving 100,000 plus service jobs in New York City. And I did a quick calculation and found that the government revenue from this is almost a 500% increase over the status quo of $2 an hour for commercial street parking. And that's assuming that parking is filled 100% of the time, which it is not. So you can think about how in New York, the state and the city shares that tax revenue almost equally, and the value that creates, which can be reinvested in communities that need it the most, places without business improvement districts, streets and communities that have not been made more friendly to walking or outdoor dining for years. We've not yet done that in New York, but San Diego has. San Diego looked at their program, looked at where it was successful and where it was not, looked at the barriers to entry as they made their program permanent, and have put in a sliding scale to receive that permit in the neighborhoods that have the least access to economic opportunity. And they are then taking the money from the program that gets through the permit fees, and they're going to reinvest them back into the neighborhoods that need that change and those investments the most. Those neighborhoods that are not well resourced, again, that don't have business improvement districts or haven't received investment in their streetscapes for a long time, which I think is a really, really smart model to think about the value created when we create our streets for people, and then who can share that value most directly. 405, this is not happening often at all. It's still this big gap in sort of the tactical, temporary to permanent, project delivery process. We're starting to work more with communities on this, is how you very intentionally link the tactical, the temporary, the interim projects to the capital investment pipeline. Which kinds of projects, what kind of, metrics do you use? What constitutes success? How do you incorporate those learnings, and how do you prioritize the projects that are the most effective, and where in a city are big open questions that need to be answered, and I think would make the whole cycle much more effective. This is Paris, France. They put in more than 50 kilometers, what they call Corona pistes, temporary bikeways, and they were all done in temporary yellow paint or traffic tape, with really cheap bollards and things like that. And you can see that on the left and on the right, they're already upgrading that street and making it permanent. This is an image I took last September. So really just less than a year and a half into it, they're already making those permanent upgrades. How do they do that? Why can't we do that this quickly in America? It takes at least 5 years at the fastest, oftentimes in the US, to get there. So many open questions moving forward on what comes next with all these pandemic responses. Some cities are moving forward to permanent, some are going in reverse. So there's a lot to kind of dig into there. Researchers, this should be a field day for all of you to kind of learn from the programs and what made them successful. And I think a lot of it is going to come down to political will. So 5, and then lastly, we all learn by doing, like physically doing these changes and experiencing them together. We should plan that way too, because the brain tends to remember 10% of what it reads, 20% of what it hears. I hope you take away 20% from my talk today, but 90% of what it does or what it simulates. So it's so important that we get out there and we do these things together. Thank you.
What's that? Oh, that's right. We have to change this. Got it. Thank you. So it's absolutely wonderful to be here. EDRA has been important to my career since I first came as a graduate student a few years ago. And it's great to be back yet again. And it's great to see you all in 3 dimensions. So wonderful. I'm going to talk for a few minutes today about 4 lessons from COVID. And these are lessons for healthcare design, but broader lessons for health design. And I think for those of us who study a wide range of environments and design them and innovate them. So I don't know about you, but during COVID, when I needed to talk to my healthcare provider, I did it via Zoom, and that this is, was of course a big trend that Mayo Clinic provided less than 1% of primary care via telehealth in 2019, 33% in 2020, and expects to provide 15 to 20% of all primary care forever via telehealth. This is not, of course, just primary care, but providing telehealth for a range of specialty care. You can now show your dermatologist your skin on telehealth. You can work with your cardiologist and provide other, your blood pressure, other things. But so in that sense, your home is becoming a healthcare setting, and we have to think of the things that make that home healthcare feel authentic, accurate, usable, and so on. But COVID also accelerated a really interesting trend, which is hospital at home. So Johns Hopkins and others had developed a model called hospital at home. Mass General, Brigham, Penn Health, and others, where you can have an acute care hospital room in your home. And these are for cardiac care, and where if you qualify in terms of being in a relatively short physical radius of a hospital, and the hospital has a team, during COVID, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services provided a waiver so that you can now get x-rays, oxygen, other things, and there's 24/7 monitoring of your health from your room at home. And that the interesting thing about this is that results have shown that it costs about 25% less than hospital care. Outcomes are as good or better, and other effects on patients are improved. Patients are up and active more quickly, that there's less hospital-induced delirium. It's particularly good for patients who have cognitive impairment or other kinds of confusion. I don't know yet whether, and some of you might, whether this waiver will continue, because most private insurance does not cover hospital at home, but it's an interesting, promising sign. And for those of you who design homes and other settings, and it raises important questions about access to broadband and other communications for underserved communities and other issues, but a really important, I think, opportunity. So healthcare more broadly is moving outside of the big white walls to home, but also my good friend and colleague, Ellen Dunham-Jones, an urban designer, has made a career of how you resurrect dead or dying malls. And an important use for malls is to be repurposed as healthcare. Malls are accessible for people who have cars, may be closer to your home than a healthcare facility. And for places like 100 Oaks in Nashville and others, you can go and do your shopping and then also do a wellness or healthcare visit. And some of these resurrected malls also have housing as part of it, so it becomes mixed use. But this also brings healthcare jobs into a community. So it's, I think, an interesting and important opportunity. Again, raises the question: how do you begin to design for a mall or retail that can be repurposed into healthcare opportunities? This is one of my favorite opportunities, which is that I had a chance to look again at the classic book, Environmental Psychology, if you've seen that came out in 1969. Some of you may not remember 1969 as well as I do. But that was one of the beginning books in our broader field. And there was a discussion there of behavior mapping, analyzing behavior in space. And what we now have is the ability through electronics to monitor behavior and health signs and outcomes. Some of this is literally health. So my colleagues at Emory provide a patch when you're released from a hospital for cardiac care, and they can monitor you closely during the first few days after discharge and find that they can significantly reduce readmissions to hospitals through 24/7, 365 monitoring. But we now have the opportunity to think of what we study, environmental behavior, as a biomarker. So the idea that we can begin to look at patterns of sleep, patterns of movement, patterns of social behavior, and look for changes in the baseline of your daily life, of your socialization, and begin to see this as an indicator of change. And so our colleagues at Georgia Tech are having the Aware Home project, for example, where they are putting into homes sensors to see whether you have gotten out of bed that morning and what time, whether you open the refrigerator, whether you use the toilet, and so on. And that by now applying AI and machine learning to these kinds of tools, we can begin to see, is this an early sign of cognitive decline? I should say this has been around for a while. My father-in-law, who was 100, lived in assisted living where they had a simple tool to say, did Julius get up that day? It's just a simple movement sensor. And they would go check on him if he didn't get up. But this is a much more sophisticated notion where we finally, right, 100 years after Fordism and the early tools, no longer have to have graduate students walking around with clipboards to measure environmental behavior, but we can now use various kinds of measures. These all raise important problems about data security and acceptance of technology and support. Nonetheless, I think we can begin to look at things like sleep on the screen now. We are involved at Georgia Tech with a project looking at sleep by people with mild cognitive impairment, wearing these kinds of tools at home. These are hospital quality tools that you can now wear on your wrist or as earbuds. And that what we know is that cognitive impairment affects sleep, but poor sleep increases cognitive impairment. So we can begin to see everyday behaviors that we know are affected by the built environment, by noise and access to nature and other things as a impact on everyday behavior and on health. We should also say that we have the opportunity to help lead the cognitive empowerment program at Georgia Tech, but our colleagues, with everyone's permission, have, in the space that we have been able to help design, have mounted 39 cameras in this space, which is used for a day program for people with mild cognitive impairment. So what we have the opportunity to do is to track movement in the space, use of the space, that using things like machine learning have looked at how does everyday behavior affect social distancing during COVID, and that we also are beginning to be able to use both hand methods that Erminia Mockery and her team have been doing, along with cameras, to begin to operationalize Prashansky, Idelson, and Rivlin's 1969 proposals to use behavior mapping as an everyday tool for understanding behavior. We will have the opportunity here both to look at how does the space work, but also look at changes in individual behavior. This is all transparent with agreement and so on. So it is the idea that we can begin to see social behavior, which in this case is a victim of cognitive decline, as the opportunity both for diagnosis, but to work with individuals in the group through things as simple as furniture design or environmental symbolism, access to nature, and so on. It's really exciting. That another lesson, however, is the idea that things changed really fast in COVID, right? We all knew that, in February of 2020, life looked pretty normal, and by March, it looked pretty abnormal. But what we've learned is that we, in this field, often move too slowly. So as you might know, I've written a fair amount over the years on post-occupancy evaluation. I still think that's a really important practice. But what post-occupancy evaluation means is that we study a building a year after it's opened or so. Those are often decisions that were made several years previous to that. It takes us a year to do our study, and then we have some conclusions. And I should say I'm a big fan of Clemson, where you all were able to, in 5-year period, go from studying operating rooms to come up with multiple mock-ups to have operating rooms in 5 years in a real clinical setting. That's fantastic. That's probably a record for our field. Having said that, we need to move even faster. And so what we were able to do during COVID was to build on work that we did in looking at Ebola, to look at work for doffing personal protective equipment, which is the most dangerous step in COVID care. And that what we were able to do, speaking of quickly, is we need to move towards a rapid innovation-focused environmental design research model that we studied, as we said, biocontainment units, but I should say that not me, but my colleagues did a remarkable thing. So Jennifer DeBose, who's here, my colleague, the associate director of our lab, came up with a simple design guide from Ebola care that could be applied to COVID. And our good friends and colleagues, many of whom are sitting in this room, within weeks translated this from English into Farsi, Portuguese, Korean, and Chinese. And that taking advantage of the international reach of our field, and these were able to get out very quickly and have impact internationally. Thank you. And so, you know, we studied doffing during COVID. We went into actual hospitals and looked and see how people actually took off their personal protective equipment. COVID is a different disease, of course, than Ebola, with different healthcare practices. But all this working with the Emory and the CDC, it wasn't the most rigorous research we've ever done. It wasn't, it wasn't a controlled, randomized control trial, but we were able to get the results out very quickly because we were able to pivot to the needs of the situation. Here's the most important lesson, though, I think, which is that what COVID did, of course, was separated us all. People became stuck in their homes, and that we spent, and a lot of others spent time looking at things like infection prevention and efficiency, reduction of waste. We focused on this in our careers and in our field, but I think the most important for us lesson from COVID was we need to focus. Whoops, sorry. There we go, thank you. We need to focus on joy. Outcomes of efficiency and safety are critical, but this drained us of joy, of self-efficacy, of empowerment. So in our work and our work with others, I think it's important that we really say, what gives us choice? What gives us power over our life? We know that the most important is social connection of various kinds, access to nature, physical activity. These are the things that we really need to take from this lesson of COVID. And I would just say that what gives me joy is working with my friends and people I care about in our lab here at Georgia Tech. That gives me joy every day. But just to build on Dina's comment, would you do me a favor and just, if you've studied at Georgia Tech, raise your hand here. If you have studied with someone who studied at Georgia Tech, raise your hand. That's joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin, Mike, Craig. With that, I think I'd like to, since we're kind of running a little bit short on time, I'd like to open it up to any questions for just a few minutes, maybe for 15 minutes. Does that sound good? If you have a question for any of the panelists here, why don't you raise your hand and Sarah will bring you a microphone. We have one over here. Thank you, Sarah. Right over here. Craig, that was a lot of impact you had.
Hello.
That is really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, people may read my papers in the future, but this is the future.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Aditya Jaydas. I'm from Oklahoma State University. I have a question for Ms. Robin Guenther. First of all, thank you for the Wendell-Berry quote. I'm going to throw a Wendell-Berry quote and ask you a question, if I may. So Wendell-Berry talks about, this is the quote, says, there are no unsacred places. There are sacred and desecrated places. So how do we go about designing these sacred places? This is from the sustainability context, because again, the awareness part is the easy part, and this is for everybody else also in the audience, right? The modification in behavior, right? So I don't know if it is whether it's like Lydon with the transitional spaces, bringing those changes, because with most of the spaces, we are all seated here in a box, right? So how do we change, how do we create this paradigm shift in this construction interior architecture field while embracing, and I just think of two words, intergenerational responsibility, right? So we have, it could be a loaded question, but I just wanted to just share that. And I know, so Dr. Zimring talking about this joy, but joy from a global context. So thank you.
That's an amazing question, actually. I think I'll give you what came to my mind is you sort of answered part of the question for yourself in the question, I think. But I think, one of the great things about what Wendell Berry writes about and is really the clarity of his position about the systems, right? And that's certainly where a lot of my systems focus comes from. And, I'll just say that another great quote that popped into my head as you were talking about the intergenerational was that he has an essay that he wrote when his brother was hospitalized, right? And he says that in a hospital, the world of love meets the world of efficiency, or they try to meet, but they don't quite connect. And that, as somebody who does healthcare, that's a quote that's guided a fair amount of my approach to healthcare design. And it's like you, Craig, bringing up joy, bringing up the joy question, is that we do have to imbue our environments with a sort of love of nature and a love of life. And I think that's what he was so good at articulating and realizing that that's what creates the cascading benefits.
Anybody else have a question?
Robin, I thought your presentation had a good conclusion at the end of saying, we in the profession look at a lot of the financial values, and then you had the conclusion of what about health, right? We should be valued by health. And then it followed by the other two presentations. How can we present health as the ROI on our projects and moving forward? And what research have you heard about, or maybe others in the audience have heard about, to say this is how your citizens and patients have better health because of the environment?
I think that exploration is in its infancy. What are the measures, right, for health outcome? What's the measure for happiness? What's the measure for inclusiveness? And I think certainly some of what you talked about would be part of that, like engaging with people, really sort of getting into the data. But I do think that's yet to come. Like, that's why people, when you see the way people talk about it in studies, they're studying, can we see air pollution and the impact on lifespan, right? And people have calculated how much we've lost in our lifespans because healthcare burns fossil fuel. We've all, by the way, lost 12 days of life because healthcare burns fossil fuel. So you can take statistics in a world of big data and find ways to put that together. I mean, that's what you all, in a sense, are doing in your research work. And those of us in the design world really look at that and then try to make those arguments to clients and within our firms, et cetera, about why this is important. But people get the health argument. I think it's actually only after the green building movement started focusing on that it really started accelerating. If you can connect the dots, people change practice. They do. But it's getting the dots connected.
I think that's a great question. Do either of you want to respond to that? So kind of how do you operationalize health or measure health? Because
I think in the world that I inhabit, most frequently, it's about the safety of our streets. And so the measure is pretty simple, actually. It's the number of crashes and their severity and the outcomes of that. I think what we don't have a lot of information about is the crash happens, it becomes a recorded statistic, someone lives or dies, but then what? The mental health impact of that on a family or an individual who survives, the psychology behind that, the economic impact of that. It's something that's not, to me, well known and well studied. And I'll just leave it with this, is that we've been doing a lot of CDC funded work in Connecticut for the past 5 years on this large grant focused on safe streets. And in the last year and a half alone, people in Connecticut have experienced more than 400,000 car crashes. 400,000, that's 10% of the population in 1 year, basically, has experienced that. Now, not everyone in that crash could be passing through and may not be a resident per se, but the order of magnitude is phenomenal. And I don't think we pay attention to that. This is just the cost of doing business in America. As we drive around and there's these crashes. So the impacts of that beyond just what happens immediately is what we need to know a lot more about.
David, of course we get David.
There's a question here, Gina.
That's great.
Yeah,
Sorry.
see, there's a question over here.
Oh, okay. Who's over here? I'm sorry. Where's the question over here? Oh, okay. Sarah, right here. We'll get to you, Dave. Right here. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm really interested in the sort of, there was one slide in Mike's presentation about the sort of return on investment being and the increase in tax dollars. And I'm interested in like the redistributive capacity of that within the site itself. In a lot of places, or that's a generalization, but in my own studies, sort of like introducing improvements to public space usually means that the population that lived there is just erased in like increases in rent or in reconstruction and just a whole bunch of other sorts of like exclusions that I think are really problematic. The other one, police interactions that just like go up dramatically. And so I'm wondering if there's ever a conversation about introducing expansions in public housing or in sort of other ways of mediating existing populations and an influx of a new population. And the slide about Oakland sort of sparked that question for me.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say that we have a really hard time as a team of professionals who are designers, where we try to have sort of a holistic view on a transportation improvement or public space improvement doesn't just have an impact for like that one sort of narrow tranche of where maybe the funding is coming from or the department that you're working with. It does and could impact housing. It could impact local businesses in various ways. And there's not a lot of tools. And in our experience, there's not a lot of overlap and collaboration amongst agencies or departments that we work with to collectively put in either the safeguards or even the evaluation methods to understand the outcomes of those investments on the negative sides of what might happen. And so, for example, we're working in the city of New Haven right now, working on a Safe Routes for All plan. So it's biking, walking, and transit with a very strong focus on these 6 neighborhoods that have the least positive health outcomes historically. And the recommendation that we're making is that there's a panel that's put in place to study the outcome of the next 3 years, every improvement or project that gets made, so that there's this rolling understanding as changes get made about what's working well and what's not from these other perspectives, not just we've reduced crashes by 50%, right? What are these other things that we're touching upon? And getting there has been really difficult, honestly. It's been really difficult to have the transportation department and understand that this is a housing issue and a zoning issue and a policy perspective that goes beyond their purview and their funding streams. And so that is like where you need the political leadership and the right questions to be asked as these changes get made. But also say the response is not to do anything, right? And you've got outcomes in places where you've got very poor public health outcomes, social outcomes, no access to open space, very dangerous streets. And you can't be afraid to try to improve those. We just need to get smarter and better at how we do it.
Excellent, excellent. Let's see, Anjali, do we have time for Dave's question? Okay, one more question. Dave, you get the last word.
Well, this may be a question for all of you. I don't know, but the notion of the tactical urbanism may, I'm trying to get my heads around how we maybe approach the same model in tactical regenerative acts or tactical sustainable acts. Craig, even his research was tactical, right? On the moment, the messy kind of quick thing. So do you have any ideas? I mean, I just got me started thinking about how do we take this big global issue of all the problems that Robin pointed out, but how do we, and it makes me even recall the slogan back for those of us who are old enough, think globally, act locally, the bumper sticker for environmentalism back in the 70s and 60s. And particularly in healthcare, right? Which is again, a big, monstrous, slow moving ocean liner of an organization or system or non-system, whatever we have. Have you given any thoughts to how we act tactically on some of those issues too?
It's a loaded question.
It is kind of a loaded question, but I'll take it on. I do think that when healthcare started in its sustainability journey, we used to talk a lot about the fact that it wasn't really going to accelerate and it wasn't going to kind of penetrate healthcare until the health arguments were made, right? Until you connected the dots, because healthcare organizations are in the business of saving lives, and that's a high purpose. And if it means they pollute, and if it means they, they need the free pass for that because, they're in a higher purpose. And I think it took a long time to actually develop enough of an evidence base, and why that the Lancet report was so important, as well as for any of you who have looked at it, the special issue that Health Affairs did the end of last year, I think, on climate change and American healthcare, because I think CEOs read that magazine a lot. And what I've seen is a real shift, but what hospitals were doing tactically in those years is doing kind of grassroots within their organization, trial projects. If you look at like the Practice Green Health, greening the OR program. That's a tactical program for hospitals to reduce waste in operating rooms. Just take a slice of your operation and optimize. Or compostable foodware. And what I believe is that hospitals generally in health systems have really worked on the operational side of pollution prevention and chemical reduction almost before they build green buildings, because they don't want to be, as one CEO once said to me, you know, I'm not going to build a LEED building while I have styrofoam cups in my cafeteria. People will laugh at me, right? So I do think a lot of healthcare sustainability has been tactical. It's been bottom up as well as top down. It's been small victories against a big, hairy, audacious goal. But I think the health argument propels that work.
Let me just a 1 second quick thought about it, which is that I think many of us in this room have a unique resource, which is students. And I think the students are really well equipped for these quick tactical approaches that we can try out. And, you know, it's an open secret that students are smarter than faculty. But I think even beyond that, it's really, that's an opportunity to try things out in weeks, months, a semester, a year and a half, try it out in the physical world, get feedback. Hospitals are happy to work with students, you know, so I think we can do that in the classroom and in a variety of academic settings. And I think, you know, the opportunity to work with you professionals in that setting with students in these quick tactical projects is a great opportunity.
Excellent. Okay, I think with that, we're gonna, Mike, are you okay? We're gonna wrap it up here because we have, we want to introduce Charmin to wrap us up. How about that?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, our speakers. Excellent presentations. We are running out of time, but I was thinking that it's okay because your presentations makes this conference really enriched. And thank you so much for coming over here. I also like to thank the conference organizer for selecting them. I also like to thank all the participants for coming in person. This is after 3 years, we are meeting in person. We last met New York for EDRA53. So with a very quick note, this is the lunch time. You will grab your lunch. You can have a walk by the river. And this is also the time for Knowledge Network. So please look into your schedule and please join the Knowledge Network after grabbing your lunch, and make sure that there is a chair in the Knowledge Network. If there is no chair, please elect someone and prepare for the next conference intensive session or presentations. That would be really nice. Thank you all, and thanks the speakers.